Chapter 7 once again. With the Great Northern War behind them, the pilots of bands of brothers were left without a mission. For the first time in more than a year, they'd been battling the forces of the North war after war since 2003. But in 2005, they were in an unwanted peace. Band of Brothers had never been interested in holding territory. It hadn't held any since its founding corporation, Evolution, helped create Fountain Alliance in 2003, and its leaders shunned the bureaucracy and politics that governing star system entailed. Evolution and its allies and Band of Brothers were fueled by warfare. They were invigorated by it, in contrast to most of the territory-owning powers of this era. Arguably the most powerful entity in New Eden didn't officially control a single star system. Access to resources and funding was made most major alliances powerful, but Band of Brothers was powerful because it enjoyed war, which made it a terrifying force for any peaceable alliance to contend with. At this time, Band of Brothers was adrift without any official home, but that was about to change. When it made its next move, it was to attack more territory, but also to start conquering it. This was new for Band of Brothers pilots, but changes in the game pushed them to make the jump from simple warmongers to proper conquerors. And it was all planned at the barbecue. The taking of New Eden. Every year, Band of Brothers held a real-world barbecue celebrating good times and unity. For a week every August, its figurehead leader, Sir Molly, abandoned his avatar and socialized with his pilots as Par Molin, a 48-year-old Swede living in Copenhagen, Denmark. For this first inaugural barbecue in 2005, Sir Molly rented an entire campground outside Copenhagen, and hundreds of Band of Brothers starship pilots would come to drink beer, eat roasted meat, and gaze drunkenly at the bright rural stars. Amid the drunken revelry, they also planned war strategy. They would convene in a large presentation room that looked like a classroom to plot out the organization's future plans. Standing at the head of the assembly, the Band of Brothers CEOs, the leaders of the Alliance's constituent corporation, revealed the Alliance's next targets and their latest fleet strategy theories. More than 100 pilots crammed into the room to watch the leaders of the Alliance scribble campaign plans on a large chartboard. They were making a blueprint for how to conquer all of Nullsec. By the end of the week-long celebration, Band of Brothers constituent corporations believed that their destiny was to become the greatest conquerors this game had ever seen. They believed wholeheartedly that Band of Brothers had more skill and potential than any other alliance, and they weren't shy about sharing that belief. They even joked about acquiring enough power to attack Empire space and grind the fictional empires under their iron boot. It would begin in Fountain. In Fountain, after years of controlling only its namesake region, Fountain Alliance had recently trounced an alliance called the Coalition of Free Stars, which resided in Delph, Quarius, and Period Basis. The region of Delph, Period Basis, and Quarius formed something like a peninsula, shooting out from the rest of the star cluster. There were very few routes that led into the peninsula, which allowed the Coalition of Free Stars to hold off groups much more powerful than itself by establishing a solid defensive choke point. However, in 2004, CCP Games added a new set of stargates into the game, which created a brand new route into that peninsula directly from Fountain. With this new route at its disposal, Fountain Alliance flooded into the Delph, Period Basis, Quarius Peninsula, and crushed the Coalition of Free Stars, which had made its home there since 2003. Refugees from the Coalition managed to hold out to Quarius, but Delph and Period Basis fell. Fountain Alliance was previously an alliance confined to just one region, but very suddenly became a 3-region empire. After humbling the Coalition of Free Stars, Fountain Alliance became one of the most feared groups in New Eden, But this turned out to be a catch-22. It was so big and so strong that it had no credible enemies, at least not while Band of Brothers was tied up fighting the Great Northern War. So its members who were interested in combat were forced to move on if they ever wanted to fight again. A large portion of Fountain Alliance combat pilots abandoned the Alliance, leaving it vulnerable. It was dreadful timing for Fountain Alliance to lose much of its military wing. Band of Brothers was on its way to Fountain's capital system. At the barbecue, the Alliance had decided that its future was no longer in the north, but in the south. But before it could conquer the south, it needed to weaken the largest entity in the region that could pose a threat to Band of Brothers. So it set its sights on assaulting the capital system of Fountain Alliance as a show of force. Band of Brothers split up, sending Reikoku into Delph to harass Fountain Alliance's miners and cargo ships, while Evolution led a fleet directly into the heart of Fountain and shut down the entire region overnight. It was a complete surprise attack, and the circumstances of the strike seemed quite underhanded to many in Eve at the time. Evolution attacked the Fountain Alliance so abruptly that it never declared war, and were still declared as allies in the game. So regardless of the fact that Evolution was besieging the system, Evolution's ship appeared to Fountain Alliance pilots to be allies. They were displayed blue on the overview, so there was no way to tell friend from foe. With the advantage of complete surprise, the battle-hardened Evolution rocked Fountain Alliance in its home system. With this unscrupulous attack and quickly took a dominant posture in the region, Fountain Alliance was a major force in the EVE universe at the time, but its pilots hadn't been through a major war. Fountain's 2,500 players vastly outnumbers Evolution's few hundred. But they weren't soldiers. Even at peak strength, Fountain Alliance would have struggled to hold off Band of Brothers, but after losing its military backbone and spreading itself thin across 3 regions, it lost any hope of a victory. Still worse, Fountain Alliance had few allies in the west. Its ally to the north, NORAD, had just been through the Great War and wasn't in any condition to fight another war. To the southeast was Stain Alliance, an old enemy that was more than happy to watch Fountain pilots be slapped around by Band of Brothers. There were no allies nearby who could come to Fountain's aid. Torn Soul, one of the leaders of Fountain Alliance, said in 2014 that the Founding Fathers came back to destroy what they had founded. He's referring to the fact that in 2003, Evolution helped create Fountain Alliance before leaving to fight the Venal Alliance. With no opportunity to plan a defense, Fountain Alliance was brought to its knees. Evolution cut it to ribbons in the region of Fountain, while Reikoku kept up to attacks in Delph. The remnants of the coalition of Free Stars and Aquarius form a group called Firmus Ixon, and join up with Band of Brothers against Fountain Alliance. When enough damage had been done, Evolution left Fountain and linked up with Reikoku in Delph to bring the region under its complete control. Delph became the first official home Band of Brothers had known in 2 years. There was just one system left to take, NOL TAC M9, and it was the key to capturing the neighboring region of Period Basis as well. You can probably make a good guess as to how the battle for this final system went based on the grandeur with which Band of Brothers remembered himself in their account of the battle. I quote, "An awe-inspiring fleet of gold, silver, green, and red gleaming hulls gathered on the fringes of the NOL TAC M9 system. Band of Brothers was expecting to engage a fleet of similar or greater size in the next few minutes. The regions south of Delph were at stake, and the atmosphere was alive with feelings of excitement and fear. Commanders were calmly discussing the way the battle would commence, reassuring the pilots within their ranks that they would be victorious, discussing how to enforce the enemy into submission, making them retreat and scatter their fleets. For the Band of Brothers, this was to be a great day. For weeks, the enemy had been advertising its intentions to crush the Band of Brothers' forces, flooding communication networks with propaganda proclaiming their alliance were the owners and protectorate of the southern regions of period bases in Delve. NOL TAC M9 was the contested system inside the Delve region, as it lay in between Delve and period bases, making it the ideal tactical outpost, allowing control over both regions. It was chosen by the mighty Bob military to reveal to the Fountain Alliance that the undeniable might of its squadrons, a force so powerful that even another group doubled its size would think twice before engaging in combat. Bob's fleet was a diverse mixture of battleships, cruisers, and support frigates, each ship equipped with the best technology available. The ships were bulky and slow, but they made up for their lack of agility with the devastating power of their lasers, railgun, howitzer, and missile batteries. The fleet had organized itself in military fashion, a staggered line designed to maximize the deadly effect of tachyon, railgun, and howitzer fire against the enemy's front, along with torpedo ships giving the extra heavy damage. The frontmen, interceptor and assault frigate squadrons, were ready to disable the enemy's means of escape by disrupting their warp drive systems and slowing them down further with electromagnetic force fields, effectively webbing the ships to stop it moving. The entire Bob fleet moved into position, eager for battle. The battle lines had been drawn and the pieces were moving. The first volley erupted from the Band of Brothers battleship fleets, its turrets taking aim and firing as one with blood-red beams and hard-hitting large hybrid, and finally projectile munition slicing through the side of stationary Megatron battleship until the vessel's hull ruptured, pieces of it scattering like dust among the rank and file of the Fountain Alliance force." End quote. The Band of Brothers fleet made quick work of the remaining Fountain Alliance forces still vying for control of Delve. The capturing of NOL was swift, and it cut off the Fountain Alliance from the region of Period, far in the south. Its brief three-region empire was cut down to just one. Had its leaders wanted to, it's likely Band of Brothers could have easily conquered the region of Fountain as well as pushing Fountain Alliance out entirely. However, they had come to understand the volatile geopolitical era of Eve. With a dozen other ambitious alliances now hungry for power in New Eden, Band of Brothers sought to insulate itself from the fracas. It pulled back from destroying Fountain Alliance, leaving it to continue holding its namesake region. Fountain was allowed to retain its name and its independence, but it was weakened and a great many of its members had left after the defeat. Sir Molly's logic was that it was better to have a weakened enemy nearby than to create a power vacuum next door that might allow a more powerful alliance to move in. In particular, Band of Brothers used Fountain Alliance as a buffer against its old rivals from the north. If any alliance from the south wanted to attack Band of Brothers, it would have to fight through Fountain Alliance to get there. Any force attempting to launch a sneak attack through Empire space would be kept an hour's travel or longer from its nearest ship cache. Reinforcement would be all but impossible. A sustained invasion of Delve from the north would be impossible without its first removing Fountain Alliance. Band of Brothers used the same strategy at its eastern flank. The remnants of the Coalition of Free Stars, Firmus Ixion, controlled Quarius as allies of Band of Brothers. For rescuing it in its alliance rule, Band of Brothers earned Firmus Ixion's great respect and loyalty. They became sparring partners, in fact, fighting in good sports and pre-arranged fleet fights, and Band of Brothers shared with Firmus its knowledge of fleet warfare. With this accomplished, the only reasonable route into Band of Brothers space was now through period bases. But that wasn't much of a worry because to the east, Paragon Sol was disputed territory. Stain Alliance was fighting to maintain control there, and there was no worry that it would break off and attack Delve. In 2003, leaders like Jade Constantine began to understand the power of politically isolating your enemies through the use of propaganda and information control. Now, Band of Brothers was beginning to understand the power of geographically isolating your enemies. When the Band of Brothers helped humble Phoenix Alliance, it wasn't because Phoenix Alliance had no allies. It was because Phoenix's largest ally was Curse Alliance, which had to travel hours to get its fleet to a fight. This was of limited use when Phoenix Alliance was already under attack, and it inevitably meant Curse Alliance's pilots eventually got sick of making the trip and stopped showing up. Band of Brothers chose allies who were close by, deliberately targeting those who had no nearby friends. It had created itself a highly protected nest in Delve, where it could incubate its master plan. Its leaders were creating a political empire to be called the Greater Band of Brothers Community, alongside their military empire. The industrial arms race. Having created its nest, Band of Brothers stopped fighting for a time in mid-2005 and settled down in peace and quiet. And it wasn't because its pilots valued peace, but because a new era had dawned in EVE Online. The times were changing, and many believed industrial power could potentially become more important than fighting skill. EVE Online was entering the era of capital ships. In July 2005, CCP Games introduced a new type of ship into EVE Online, Dreadnoughts. These were huge siege ships designed not for maneuverability but for pure firepower. When these titanic artillery ships, each several kilometers in length, lumbered into position, they could enter siege mode and deal extreme amounts of damage. They were designed to rip into entrenched position and destroy player-owned star bases, but they were vulnerable to fast battleship fleet because their enormous guns were too slow to target small, fast ships. An arms race sprouted up across New Eden. In the new era of territorial warfare in Nullsec, dreadnoughts were indispensable tools for invading enemy territory, and every alliance wanted its own fleet of these siege ships. They were capable of such fierce power that many consider them to be the be-all, end-all of fleet combat. But their cost was commensurate with their strength. It could take more than a week for even a major industrial power to build just one dreadnought. To keep up with this arms race, Band of Brothers had to put down roots and establish profitable money-making enterprises and round-the-clock shipyards, all producing these new expensive war assets. No longer could a purely nomadic combat force maintain the industrial operation required to stay atop the EVE food chain. In its new home base, Band of Brothers controlled the 97 star systems of Delve, and each of those systems had moons around it. In fact, Delve's systems were quite moon plentiful. The most sparse system has 6, while the most moon plentiful had 120. A total of 4,330 moons across the Delve region. Each of these moons can be harvested for materials by setting up a starbase and a silo near them. Moon mining was one of the biggest reasons for taking sovereignty in Nullsec. Simply by setting up and defending this infrastructure, an alliance would make billions of ISK per month extracting moon goo, as the players sometimes call it, from moons. They didn't need to mine it back then. Delve is a particularly rich region, which is one reason why Band of Brothers sought to take it. Once an alliance had set up a steady moon mining operation, it could start to ship the ore off to be refined at nearby factories. The refined minerals could either be sold on the markets in Empire space or kept and used in the production of ships and ammunition. Once effective mining operations were set up, an alliance could deploy capital ship assembly arrays which fit modularly onto existing star bases. Every alliance was working to build capital shipyards and keep them in full, smooth production. A dreadnought's weapon arrays, armor plating, engines, shield generators, and etc. 12 separate components, all had to be built separately and delivered to the main shipyard as efficiently as possible. In order to build capital ships, alliances needed blueprints to work from. There are two types of blueprints in EVE, originals and copies. Blueprint copies are essentially consumable items that wear out after a limited number of uses. Blueprint originals, however, can be used and copied any number of times. They can also be improved through research to produce ships more quickly and cheaply. Blueprint originals were highly controversial in this era of EVE. Common ship and component blueprint copies could be purchased from AI characters, but the more rare and specialized ship and modules, blueprint originals called Tech 2, were controlled by the players. They were originally distributed by the game's developer through a lottery system. Players could earn more chances to win Blueprint Original based on their participation in an event leading up to their release. And once the originals were handed out, the players controlled how they were used. Band of Brothers, and several other nullsec alliances, had gathered large collections of Blueprint Originals. And they made great sums of money making and selling Blueprint copies. The major nullsec alliances bought as many original as they could and carteled the sale of copies, constricting the supply and keeping the price artificially high. This system was controversial because it ensured that one of the best ways to make money in EVE was tightly controlled by the existing power. Any new group that tried to make its mark on nullsec would be facing established nullsec powers with far stronger cash flow resulting from their iron grip on the blueprint business. The New Delve homeland of Band of Brothers buzzed with commerce. Its enterprises collected ores, refined them, and built grand armadas from the produce. Dreadnought were just the beginning. An entire new class of warship was being prepared by CCP Games. Capital ships. Dreadnoughts were followed by carriers. Logistical ships that carry fighters, extra-large combat drones. Carriers can also be used to store additional ships for the fleet, allowing pilots who have lost their ship to fly an escape pod to a carrier and equip themselves for battle once again. Carriers are a force magnifier in any fleet. CCP also designed a much larger variant of the carrier called the Mothership. The Mothership was a beast to behold and could serve as a mobile invasion platform. As with all ships, there are 4 variants of Motherships, one for each of the computer-controlled faction from expired space. The most common, the Galante Nyx, was as flat as a pancake and nearly as round. More than 3 kilometers long, small fighter drone launched directly from the belly of this mammoth ship through a runway opening in its center. A carrier could be built within the week, of concerted effort of course, but a mothership could take upwards of a month to be constructed. Of course, that's only in one single shipyard, and the wealthiest alliances could have dozens of shipyards producing as many ships as they could afford. But even the motherships paled in comparison to the mightiest ship class that New Eden had ever seen, Titan-class ships. They could take over 3 months to build, weighted 5 billion pounds or 2.2 billion kilograms, and measured more than 9 miles long or 13.7 kilometers. Even in the realm of science fiction, the Avatar-type Titan is one of the largest ships ever imagined. Titans made the largest ship of the previous era, battleships, look almost comically tiny. The construction of a Titan cost an unheard of 70 billion ISK, which would have carried a price of about 6,000 in 2005 United States dollar if ISK could have been traded for real money. Titans are hundreds of times larger than an average ship and capable of extreme firepower, with their traditional rows of laser cannons, but they also have a powerful weapon called a Doomsday. This enormous cannon could strike an entire fleet of ships at once, wiping out every small ship within 500 kilometers. In EVE terms, this is a very large radius. Basically anything the Titan could see in the star system. The Doomsday was the nuclear bomb of EVE Online, and everyone was racing to be the first to get their hands on it. The Mothership. The arms race to produce capital ships shook up the political situation in New Eden as well. The most influential example of this became known as the EC-TAC P8R incident. In the aftermath of the Great Northern War, a new alliance called Trust had secured power in the north alongside its close allies, the entirely German G-Alliance. Their combined strength and sophisticated approach to industry had put them on the fast track to creating one of the very first motherships in the game. It was being built in a shipyard in EC-TAC P8R in the region of Pure Blind, but the secret was poorly kept. In this era of EVE Online, spying was not yet widespread, and G-Alliance or Trust had not effectively safeguarded against information leaks. Spies from Southern Power, Ascendant Frontier, an alliance which will be introduced in greater detail in subsequent chapters, and Band of Brothers were able to ascertain not just what G-Alliance was building, but exactly where was being constructed, and when it would be completed. Much of the strategy in this era of nullsec warfare revolved around constructing your own capital ship fleet while working to deny your enemies their own. When Band of Brothers and Ascendant Frontier found out the details of G-Alliance's capital ship program, they moved to shut it down. A joint strike force mobilized, bringing together forces from Band of Brothers, Ascendant Frontier, and Axiom Empire, a splinter group of close ally of Ascendant Frontier. They moved out of the southern territories and brought their combined might against Trust and G-Alliance in one of the largest military maneuvers in the history of the game. Hundreds of ships from the two strongest alliances in EVE Online brought the hammer down on EC-TAC. The battle was a disaster for the combined G-Alliance, and EC-TAC was placed under an unbreakable blockade. Every single piece of infrastructures in the system, about 40 star bases plus several shipyards, were obliterated, and the attacking forces were able to lock down the system for a full week. 24 hours a day, there were hundreds of Band of Brothers and Ascendant Frontier ships occupying the system. The ramifications were much more significant than simply the loss of a single mothership. The confidence of all New Eden was shaken. G-Alliance and Trust were major alliances, and they had been brutally brushed aside by the mega coalition of Ascendant Frontier and Band of Brothers. This sent a message to all of New Eden. You can't survive on your own anymore. If Band of Brothers and Ascendant Frontier move all the way across the star cluster to bloody the nose of the well-respected Germans that they could hit anybody, anywhere, no longer could every alliance on the map aspire to single-handedly crush the universe. Everyone needed to be part of a mega coalition in order to defend against the threat of other mega coalitions. These types of joint coalitions were hinted at briefly during the Great Northern War, but now they were becoming a big part of EVE's political game. The fear, however, was that coalitions could end up triggering a war that would engulf all of New Eden. The joint operation between Band of Brothers and Ascendant Frontier was a landmark moment in nullsec politics. Many in New Eden began to wonder if the two would come together permanently to form a coalition that threatened to be unstoppable. The military might of Band of Brothers, backed up by the incredible industrial power of Ascendant Frontier, would have been enough to conquer the whole of EVE. The bond didn't last, though, and this was proven to be an alliance of convenience for the sole purpose of crushing EC-TAC. With the operation in the north complete, the two alliances separated and returned home to build capitals. Band of Brothers was no slouch in its industrial department. In its Delve headquarters, it managed to build a small fleet of dreadnoughts, and it was looking to test them out to see what these new ships were capable of. On July 2nd, 2005, Band of Brothers gathered its dreadnoughts and advanced once again into Fountain. Fountain Alliance was a soft target Band of Brothers had already roughed up once, and thus it posed little threat to Bob's new dreadnought fleet. The Band of Brothers assault struck deep into the heart of Fountain, and it fought all the way to YZTAC LQL, the capital system of Fountain Alliance. Band of Brothers deployed a starbase and put a chokehold on Fountain Alliance. Its pilots entrenched themselves right into the home system, and there was little Fountain Alliance could do to stop them. From its new base in the heart of Fountain, Band of Brothers began raiding the surrounding system, firing upon any ship unlucky enough to cross the path of its marauding fleets. Fountain Alliance fleet commanders formed a strategy it hoped would break the blockade and give them a chance to fight back. They outfitted ships to essentially become snipers, capable of warping into the system extremely far away from enemy forces and attempting to knock out smaller support ships with long-range volleys before retreating. The strategy didn't do much to loosen the grip around the throat of Fountain Alliance. When the enemy is in your base, you need more than snipers to drive it back. Over 2 weeks, Band of Brothers suffered minimal ship losses. Fountain Alliance wouldn't risk engaging in a large fight against the invaders, and their morale was plummeting. Its membership began to fall swiftly as its pilots realized they had little hope of defending themselves against the far more experienced fleets of Band of Brothers. From a peak of over 2,500 members, Fountain Alliance was now down to 8. Then, the nail in the coffin. A member of Band of Brothers managed to infiltrate the ranks of a corporation in Fountain Alliance. This corporation was responsible for the maintenance of a large number of player-owned star bases, which provided much of Fountain Alliance's defense, and gave it official sovereignty over the region. The infiltrator worked his way up this corporation until he had access to the control of its star bases. Then he removed the fuel from every one of those star bases. Player-owned star bases rely on fuel called strontium for protection. When an alliance attacks and reduces a starbase shields to 25% strength, the starbase goes into reinforced mode, which makes it invulnerable for a period of time, depending on how much strontium is loaded into it. It's a system intended to allow defenders time to plan a defense. Otherwise, an enemy could simply walk in during an alliance's off-time zone and destroy their bases. While in reinforced mode, the starbase can be neither repaired nor attacked until the strontium fuel runs out. Alliances will usually put 36 hours of strontium in a starbase so that they'll have time to organize a defense. This also guarantees the starbase will come out of reinforced mode in the opposite time zone of when it was originally reinforced in. Once a starbase is in reinforced mode, the attackers will leave and then return to fight the main battle when the strontium timer elapses. After the spy removed the strontium fuel, the star bases were rendered vulnerable and they were swiftly obliterated by the Band of Brothers capital fleet. Band of Brothers council member Blacklight was quick to declare this the end of Fountain campaign. Effective immediately, in quote, the Fountain region and all systems therein are claimed by Band of Brothers. We consider our campaign to conquer the region and evict Fountain Alliance complete. Along with the regions of Delve and Period bases, Fountain is now under Band of Brothers control and sovereignty. Blacklight, council member, Band of Brothers, July 26, 2005. The exodus from Fountain Alliance continued as its membership fell below 600, and it lost any claim to the region of Fountain. It had lost control of Fountain for the first time since the inception of Eve, more than 2 years earlier. In the words of Torn Soul, Fountain Alliance CEO, in my interview with him in 2014, Fountain Alliance had been exposed as a paper tiger. The pendulum. After the conclusion of the Fountain campaign, Band of Brothers kept pushing north onto Outer Ring to fight NORAD. Band of Brothers swept through the region in November 2005, capturing most of the region before abruptly pulling back. It was part of a scheme that has since been dubbed the Pendulum Wars. Band of Brothers members love combat, and the directors needed to give their pilots adversaries to fight in order to keep the group entertained and unified. It's one of the most counterintuitive aspects of power in EVE Online. Being a leader also means being an event creator for your people. If a leader wants to retain their pilots' loyalty, then they need to offer them a steady stream of fun. Band of Brothers pilots enjoy combat, so at times Sormoli and his co-leader Dianabolic had to take risks to sate that desire, even when it seemed more strategically sound to just stay in Delph and build. So Band of Brothers commanders worked out a plan to antagonize nearby neighbors into attacking them in Delph. The Alliance's military moved north, destroying ships from NORAD in the Alliance Dusk and Dawn. Then it pulled back to Delph. There could be 60 or 70 stargates between Band of Brothers' home star system and its adversaries in the far north. Put simply, its pilots were tired of making the hours-long trip up there to fight, so they conspired to bring their enemies to them. They would attack, antagonize for a week or two, then retreat. Band of Brothers wasn't satisfied with just one opponent attacking in its territory. It wanted to piss off the only other alliance in the game that rivaled its power. In quote, "We went into the north and made them hate us," said Band of Brothers leader Sormoli in 2014. "We'd do everything we could to make them hate us. Then we'd leave them alone and go home. Then we would have infinite combat opportunities for 2 years, and we'd never need to go anywhere. We were cocky as hell." End quote. With the Northern Alliances successfully antagonized, Band of Brothers returned south to Delph and began looking for the next alliance it would antagonize. It soon realized that the mighty Ascendant Frontier to the east was the best target. So Band of Brothers set out to anger the fleets of its eastern neighbors. At this point, Band of Brothers and Ascendant Frontier were something akin to allies and had worked together to crush the North ECTAC P-8R. Ascendant Frontier had spurned their own allies in the past in order to keep good relations with Band of Brothers, but Sormoli was ambitious. He saw himself as a destroyer of empires, and there was no greater empire in New Eden than Ascendant Frontier in 2005. Sormoli wanted to bring glory to the Band of Brothers' name and its pilots by invading the only other alliance who could possibly stand against them. The invasion of Ascendant Frontier would prove to be one of the most significant turning points in the history of EVE Online. Chapter 8: Rise of Ascendant Frontier. Just a second to refresh my brain. On March 17, 2004, the video game publishing giant Electronic Arts changed the EVE universe. Electronic Arts was the publisher of EVE Online's only real competition in sci-fi MMORPGs, Earth and Beyond. The two games shared a sci-fi and spaceship theme, but Earth and Beyond was a year older than EVE Online, so while EVE Online was just getting started, players were heavily invested in Earth and Beyond. But on March 17, 2004, Electronic Arts announced that after 2 years, Earth and Beyond would be shut down within 6 months. With its servers gone, the game would no longer be playable, and everything that had happened in that virtual universe would essentially be erased. Like refugees, entire groups of Earth and Beyond players began leaving the game for the stability of EVE Online. Many of those who started in Earth and Beyond already had strong social ties with each other, and they had a ready-made community when they arrived in New Eden. Is the music gone? Well, when they arrived in New Eden, the mass departures from Earth Beyond were the critical force that shaped the south of New Eden from 2004 and 2006. Several player organizations were transplanted directly from Earth and Beyond into EVE Online. A large contingent of players left Earth and Beyond to join Stain Alliance. Another large block formed a corporation called Celestial Horizon. This mass arrival of E&B players turned Celestial Horizon into one of EVE's early mega corporation. The pilots of Celestial Horizon generally weren't hardcore players yet, but they had among them many leaders who understood how to run large gamer organization and had mastered the art of keeping hundreds of players together as one entity. Under the leadership of Celestial Horizon's second CEO, Cyvok, Celestial Horizon became extremely wealthy and large in Empire space, and Cyvok decided to make a play for territory in Nullsec. Cyvok was nothing if not a hard worker. He usually played EVE from various United States Air Force bases throughout Europe, where he was stationed as a satellite communications expert. Between his high-stress job with the US military and providing direction to hundreds of pilots and builders in Celestial Horizon, he was working about 100 hours a week. Nonetheless, in an interview, he described his time with the Alliance as some of the best of his life. He identified the region of Abyssal as a potential starter home for Celestial Horizon. It was technically under the control of a German alliance called Zetic Federation, but Abyssal was so remote that it was essentially uninhabited. Cyvok rallied Celestial Horizon's military wing and set out onto an exploratory expedition to Abyssal. He was venturing out into unfriendly territory, so he couldn't risk bringing everybody along. But he did need to show Zetic that Celestial Horizon was serious about controlling Abyssal. The arrival of a squatter corporation in Abyssal angered Zetic, but Celestial Horizon gave Zetic a choice. Either go to war with our thousands of members, or let us give you money. Zetic chose the latter. Celestial Horizon was so wealthy that it was able to buy Zetic leaders off, and it began renting Abyssal for itself and establish a de facto alliance with Zetic. The two became business partners, or allies of convenience, whichever term you prefer. Unknown to Zetic Federation, Celestial Horizon had no intention of honoring this arrangement for long. Schism. With their new and uneasy alliance, Zetic and Celestial Horizon formed one of the dominant powers in New Eden. They continued absorbing other groups and charging them for access to Zetic space, until the new massive alliance tallied more members than any other group within EVE, roughly 2,000. The total dwarfed the numbers of any other group in the game, but there was a crisis of governance. Zetic was convinced Celestial Horizon was evil, and we were just trying to take over the alliance, Cyvok said. Although Zetic was allowed Cyvok to purchase the rights to live in Abyssal and become an ally, Zetic never fully trusted it. Many within Zetic believe it was only a matter of time until Celestial Horizon became even more wealthy and tried to capture the rest of Zetic's territory. And they were correct from the standpoint that we were trying to take over the Alliance, said Cyvok. They were wrong from the standpoint that we were evil. We had no say in leadership. We had no say in how things ran, how things were organized. Zetic basically would rent out their territory and get fat and happy on the slaves. Sivok oversells his point a bit when he describes Celestial Horizon as Zedek's slaves. What he means is Zedek didn't have to do any work to continue collecting taxes from Celestial Horizon in Fithabolis. The renting of Fithabolis was a good deal for Celestial Horizon at first, but after a while, Celestial Horizon pilots began to wonder why they were still paying rent to an absentee landlord. The Uneasy Alliance became heated when two attacks struck Zedek and Celestial Horizon's territory simultaneously. An enemy alliance called the Five, flush with power after the collapse of Curse Alliance, attacked Celestial Horizon territory in Fethabolis. Meanwhile, G Alliance had come down from the north to invade Imentia, which was Zedek territory. This plagued Zedek and Celestial Horizon at odds. Because Zedek was leasing Fethabolis to Celestial Horizon, it had less of an emotional stake in its well-being. So Zedek's leaders commanded Sivok to abandon Fethabolis and move his fleets north to protect Zedek's assets in the region of Imentia. Celestial Horizon opted instead to split its forces in half, and attempted to defend both regions at once. Those left behind in Fethabolis fought tooth and nail to keep the Five at bay. This was a tall order because the Five included some very good combat pilots, while Celestial Horizon was far better known for its accomplishment in industry than in warfare. For weeks, it held off raiding attacks from the Five in Fethabolis while half its forces were off fighting in Imentia against the G Alliance invasion. All the while, Sivok's resentment grew. After weeks of endless raids by the Five, Sivok had an epiphany and found a way to end the war. Those who have come to conquer your territory, he reasoned, are never going to be sated by a ceasefire. No invading army cheers, "We fought them to a draw, huzzah!" So Sivok appealed to the Five conquerors' instinct and gave them a better target: Zedek. Sivok offered the Five a deal: "Leave us alone and we'll stay out of it if you head north and attack Zedek Federation." Sivok told the Five leaders that Zedek had grown weak and complacent living off the taxes from Celestial Horizon, and that it wasn't capable of defending itself from an organized attack without the aid of Celestial Horizon. It turned out he was right. The Five invaded Zedek territory, and without Celestial Horizon's forces to back them up, Zedek crumbled from the pressure, allowing the Five to annex both Imentia and Tenerifis. The crushing of Zedek Federation briefly turned the Five into the largest territory-owning alliance in EVE Online history, as it now controlled 5 regions and would soon capture 4 more from Red Alliance. With Zedek in complete disarray, a number of corporations defected and joined Celestial Horizon, while others joined Stain Alliance or left the South entirely. The formal vassals of Zedek Federation had overthrown the lords of the land. Celestial Horizon now found itself the sole owner of Impasse and Fethabolis, with 2 regions all its own and a cadre of members of corporation following its lead. Celestial Horizon formed a brand new alliance, Ascendant Frontier. Ascendant Frontier prospered in Impasse and Fethabolis, and it's set to work building an empire. With the civil war currently raging in the nearby region of Stain, it opened the door for Ascendant Frontier to fill the power vacuum left by the conflict. In February 2006, Ascendant Frontier was able to annex most of Esoteria and Omist. A month later, however, Ascendant Frontier judged it had become too big for its own good. It controlled 4 regions and boasted upwards of 3,000 players by some estimates. Some within the Alliance started to worry that its smaller social groups were standing to lose their identity. Ordinarily, this is the start of problems from an alliance, as the struggle for representation leads to coups and civil wars. Ascendant Frontier decided to handle its internal strife with diplomacy rather than force. One of the most widely recognized Ascendant Frontier leaders alongside Sivok, named Steel Rat, was given the go-ahead to splinter off and form an entirely new alliance called Axiom Empire. Axiom Empire was given complete, no strings attached dominion over Impasse, and any Ascendant Frontier member was allowed to join Axiom's rank if they pleased. Reports indicate that about 1,300 went to Axiom. Generally, Axiom's members were those who preferred to fight more than build. Giving away a quarter of your territory and personnel is a risky gambit, but it paid off handsomely for Ascendant Frontier. The two alliances became inseparable allies and they operated almost as one entity. Drawing a rift between the two actually brought them closer together. Wealth and power. Along its path to power in the south, Ascendant Frontier's leaders recognized that their might depended entirely on their alliance's massive size and wealth. It wasn't their pilots' skill in battle, but the alliance's strength of arms that kept its enemies at bay. This reliance on numbers rather than prowess fostered an affinity for others who wielded power the same way. In particular, it led Ascendant Frontier and Axiom Empire to look fondly upon the Goon Swarm alliance that was coming of age in Syndicate. But Sivok was no fool, and he understood that diplomatic ties needed to be maintained with traditional powers as well. Band of Brothers was the name on everybody's lips at the time in 2006, and it was Ascendant Frontier's neighbor to the west. Sivok worked hard to stay on the good side of the alliance that everyone in Eve considered invincible. This wasn't an easy task. Bob leadership had developed a very high opinion of itself, and its pilots believed they were the game's elite combat force. Logically, that meant everyone else was mediocre at best. Band of Brothers worked together with Sivok on occasion, but its members held little respect for Ascendant Frontier. That was due in part to the fact that Ascendant Frontier was not focused on expansion or military endeavors as Band of Brothers was. Ascendant Frontier had come to own a huge swath of territory in the south, but its members' true passion was in industry and commerce. Ascendant Frontier wanted to create a prosperous hub of trade and commerce in Nullsec. It was working too. It was pumping out space stations, outposts, and capital ships at a rate many times faster than the next closest industrial powers of the era. Yet, despite their differences, Band of Brothers and Ascendant Frontier did work together from time to time when it was mutually beneficial. One day, in April 2006, Band of Brothers approached Ascendant Frontier to inform its leader that the Northern Alliance were building a mothership. Those alliances comprised many of Ascendant Frontier's enemies, and they continued to be a thorn in his side. Sivok saw two opportunities. First, he could weaken enemies in the north who sought to disrupt his industrial empire in the south. Second, he could shore up ties with Band of Brothers and bond with its leadership over a week of cooperative destruction. This was the EC-TAC P8R incident, detailed in the previous chapter, in which Ascendant Frontier and Band of Brothers worked together to blockade and ravage the northern system of EC-TAC P8R. The birth of a type. After returning from the destruction of EC-TAC, Ascendant Frontier put the focus back on its own endeavors. Sivok and Alliance leaderships were steadfastly focused on quietly building New Eden's first Titan-class ship. They'd be building it for months, and it was finally nearing completion. The Secret Titan project was a marvel of engineering regardless of the fact it took place in a video game. The plan for the project was laid out by Sivok and a very small group of others, but the construction necessitated the labors of thousands of other individuals. An equipped Titan consists of about 19 separate parts, which each need to be individually crafted using huge quantities of smaller parts and rare minerals. Only a behemoth alliance the size of Ascendant Frontier had a hope of building one of these monstrosities in a reasonable time frame. The only thing harder than assembling thousands of people to contribute to the task was keeping the whole thing a secret. Nobody yet knew how powerful Titans were in combat. It was understood that a single Titan could change the balance of power in the entire star cluster. Ascendant Frontier's enemies would never have allowed it to be completed. They would have rallied together in common cause and crushed the shipyard where it was being constructed, just as Ascendant Frontier did to the mothership in EC TAC. This information had to be kept out of the hands of every potential spy, and that meant keeping it a secret even from devoted Ascendant Frontier directors. Loose lips, after all, sink ships. And so, like a digital Manhattan project, the architects toiled and plotted in secret while the actual laborers who mined the materials and built the component had no idea what they were actually working on. From the start, Psyvok and his lieutenants knew the deck would be stacked against them as they worked to complete the Titan. By this point, all the other organizations in EVE had become aware of the massive industrial power of Ascendant Frontier and its passion for being the first in New Eden to achieve great feats of construction. Psyvok knew he needed not one, but several backup plans, as well as covert misinformation campaigns to pull off a project of such scale. The massive cost of the Titan was no issue for the ultra-wealthy Ascendant Frontier, so it took an extraordinarily devious step, contracting out the construction of a second Titan at the same time as a distraction. Initially, Ascendant Frontier had contracted out the project to an industrial corporation called Naga, which was extremely well known as a major industrial contractor. Its efficiency at coordinating thousands of players around hundreds of simultaneous construction projects allowed it to flood the marketplace of EVE Online with products set at dirt cheap prices. Naga was the obvious choice for a construction project of this size. It wasn't a tightly sealed nullsec power. Word of the Titan contract leaked through Naga. Its capital shipyards were destroyed by a well-known gun-for-hire organization called Mercenary Coalition, working for an unknown client. Just days before construction was to begin on Ascendant Frontier's Titan. If Ascendant Frontier's leader weren't scared before, they were now. Psyvok and his lieutenants were dismayed that the ruse had failed so quickly. It negated months of cover and distraction that Naga could have provided. The new plan was to build a Titan in the last place any spy would expect, in the dead center of Ascendant's Frontier nullsec territory. The most obvious place imaginable. Was one of the most heavily traveled systems for both Alliance members and enemy raiding parties. Psyvok knew hiding the Titan wasn't feasible, so he built the thing right under everyone's noses. All the while, Ascendant Frontier agents spread false information to throw people off the trail of the Titan. The first step in getting construction back on track with the plan was to build another decoy, a brand new capital shipyard in the heart of Abyssal. Both the region and the system where it was built, Joe, TAC 32L, were guarded like a fortress. The outpost was useful for many things, but its main purpose was to draw the gaze of Ascendant Frontier's enemies and get spies whispering about the secret new facility. Psyvok said it worked in 2006 progress report about the Titan project. Groen fleet was 100% convinced this is where Ascendant Frontier was building its Titan, and intel suggests that this information was also passed on to Band of Brothers as well. And then many Bothans died. Ascendant Frontier had 5 capital shipyards in its main block of territory. The Titan project was the main focus, but it also had the time and the resources to build a mothership as well, another decoy. Psyvok tasked the construction of the mothership to one of his member alliances he knew to be rife with enemy spies. They were former members of Zedic Federation who had joined Ascendant Frontier after their former alliance was destroyed. Sivok wanted word to leak about the mothership because nobody would believe Ascendant Frontier was wealthy enough to build both a mothership and a Titan simultaneously. He knew it was only a matter of time until a disgruntled executive member leaked the information. It was September 2006 and the Titan was well underway. A massive mining operation involving hundreds of people had stripped the asteroid belts of nearby regions clean daily. Hauling efforts took more than a week simply to load up the raw materials from the warehouses where they were being stored and ship them off to the secret factories where the components were being built. A portion of those materials were diverted to the mothership project. Privately, Sivok confessed personally causing delays in the mothership's construction. The sheer amount of material Ascendant Frontier was shipping to its factories and shipyards was bound to tip off enemy-covered scouts and spies. If it finished the mothership before it was done moving so much material, it would quickly become obvious that another major ship was being built as well. Sivok wanted any spies confused, and he wanted to give them as little time as possible to solve the riddle. The Titan was nearing completion toward the end of September 2006, and the stress was beginning to wear down the few in Ascendant Frontier who knew the details. The stress and paranoia of the security situation was nearly breaking me, said Sivok. The 9 days, between 8 and 14 hours a day, of component hauling was the most boring thing I have ever done in Eve. The 2 months of mineral compression killed my drive to ever build again. I had help, of course, but only one other person, and he was losing his mind also. After 3 long months of planning, deception, and labor, Ascendant Frontier was finally ready to complete the Titan. The countdown began, and the few elite leaders of Ascendant Frontier who knew about the Titan gathered to watch the countdown. All eyes were on the capital ship assembly array as they waited for the Titan to appear in space. 3 minutes to go. 2 minutes. 1 minute. In what would have been the final moment, the gears of the shipyard came to a halt and nothing happened. Rather than the finished Titan slipping into space, everything stopped. There was a bug. Ascendant Frontier had actually been so efficient it had finished building the Titan before CCP Games had finished all of the code to implement Titans in the game. This is hilarious. Oh my god. These ships were such colossal undertakings that CCP assumed they had time to complete the code before anybody could actually build one. The bit of code that allowed Titans to be launched from a capital shipyard hadn't been written yet. Within 2 minutes, CCP developers were on the scene and privately met with Sivok. They audited the build operation, verified that everything needed for the construction was present, and manually materialized an avatar Titan next to the shipyard. Still paranoid, it took Sivok 6 hours to announce the completion of the landmark warship, fearing somehow he could still jinx the months-long project. The completion of the Avatar represents another true first for Eve, brought forward by the hard work and dedication of all the members of the Ascendant Frontier and Axiom Empire community. Together, there is no challenge we cannot accomplish. The face of warfare in Eve has just changed forever. Now let's name the bugger. Sivok, CEO, Celestial Horizon, Ascendant Frontier. And they named it Steve. Steve the Titan. I have no clue. Great. A wave of panic hit EVE Online. Wannabe economists, theoreticians, and Ascendant Frontier rivals breathlessly prophesied that the power balance of the game would be broken. In the past, alliances focused on industry, production, and building were formidable entities, but were generally bested by military-focused powers. Small groups of talented combat pilots could take down industrial alliances many times their size. This was good for the in-game economy because it meant that everything exploded eventually. Industrialists would build immense defensive structures and enormous stockpiles of ships in their home regions, but it was only a matter of time before a force of enemies would assemble to break down at least some of what they built. Ascendant Frontier's shockingly quick construction of Steve the Titan threatened to bring a new paradigm. What if the Alliance could just keep building Titans? A Titan was meant to be an extremely rare type of ship, and the community had assumed that only a few would be created within the first year or two. Ascendant Frontier had shown that it could potentially build a half-dozen Titans within a year. Everyone was afraid of what Ascendant Frontier, now over 3,000 players, were capable of if they committed to building an entire fleet of Titans. Many EVE Online players were convinced that just one Titan's Doomsday weapon was enough to win any battle single-handedly. Doomsday weapons didn't even need to be aimed. They inflicted an enormous amount of damage everywhere within 500 kilometers. A huge distance even on the scale of fleet fights between hundreds of pilots. It essentially made smaller ships useless, as they disintegrate after a single Doomsday blast. Now, New Eden faced the prospect of a fleet which could strike with multiple Doomsday weapons every single engagement. The militaries of Nullsec shuddered at the thought of their territory being invaded by miners and factory workers who knew little about combat, but who bulldozed all in their way with superior weaponry. War profiteers of New Eden likewise dreaded an end to war, or at least a drastic slowdown caused by the proliferation of Doomsday deterrents. The potential threat of Ascendant Frontier's Titan made it the most high-profile target in all New Eden. Band of Brothers began immediately making plans to invade Ascendant Frontier and kill Steve the Titan. In 2014, Cyvok described to me the three-way informal meetings between himself, Sir Molly of Band of Brothers, and Celine, the leader of an up-and-coming group of professional soldiers called Mercenary Coalition. Celine's Mercenary Coalition had gained a reputation as one of the best fleets in the game. Band of Brothers was one of its steadiest employers. Together, the three of them controlled almost the entire south of New Eden. Myself and Celine used the EC TAC incident example as an argument of why it would be so good if Band of Brothers and Ascendant Frontier worked together. Continued Cyvok. We didn't need to be allies. We didn't need to follow the same code of ethics. We didn't need to play the game the same way, but we could interact strategically so it could benefit both of us. Sir Molly was unswayed. Ascendant Frontier now had a bullseye on its back. It was symbolic of a frightening new dawn in EVE Online, where the chaos of Nullsec was ruled by engineers rather than militaries. Ascendant Frontier was aware of this, and its spies relayed information about the impending Band of Brothers invasion plot. Cyvok began making plans to defend his alliance from an imminent attack by Band of Brothers. War was coming to the south. I have said many times, I have said many times that Ascendant Frontier is not perfect. Despite that fact, we have achieved an amazing amount in a very short time. All the credit for everything we have achieved goes directly to our citizens. We have chosen to meet this latest challenge head-on, as always, and we will not back down. Once again, we call upon our leaders and most of all our citizens to build our front line and take those lines to our enemies. The Ascendant Frontier was built on the backs of our citizens. Now its fate is in your hands. Ascendant Frontier will once again earn its freedom and its right to exist in this universe. Ascendant Frontier is strength. We are unity. Strength through unity. Honor and serve. Cyvok, Director of Ascendant Frontier, at an unknown date. That was the end of chapter number 8. So we're nearing into the 2 hours into the class, and I know there's other classes coming up and stuff on Twitch, so I'll be letting my plays behind. This has all been recorded, so if anyone has missed parts of it or wants to see part 1 or 2, it's all on my private YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/zkav, ZKAV, and it's going to be also into the forum discussion about this event. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining me, and I hope you have some great day.
Thanks for the story, Dreeza.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Thanks for the story. Good one.
Thanks, Rita.